They called me by a strange name, never showed baby photos. The whole family avoided talking about it. Then I saw myself in a documentary, and everything became clear. Growing up, I always felt like something was off about my story. You know that feeling when everyone around you seems to be in on some secret, but you can't quite put your finger on what it is? That was my entire childhood. Every time I'd ask about baby photos, Mom would get this weird look in her eyes and change the subject. She'd shuffle around, suddenly very interested in cleaning the kitchen counter or organizing something that didn't need organizing. The photo albums in our house started when I was around 3 years old. Before that, nothing. Just a complete void where my earliest memories should have been documented. I'd flip through those albums over and over, searching for any trace of my infant self, but there was absolutely nothing. When I was maybe 7 or 8, I remember asking Mom directly about it during one of those quiet Sunday afternoons when she was doing laundry. She paused for the longest time, holding one of my dad's shirts against her chest, and then said something that stuck with me for years. She told me the camera broke right after I was born, and they couldn't afford a new one for a while. Even as a kid, that explanation felt hollow. We weren't rich, but we weren't so poor that a disposable camera would break the bank. Plus, everyone had relatives with cameras back then. Someone would have taken pictures. The name thing was another puzzle piece that never quite fit. On all my school documents, medical records, everything official, I had one name. But at home, the family called me something completely different. When I'd point this out, Mom would wave her hand dismissively and say that paperwork was nonsense, that what really mattered was what the people who loved you called you. She had this way of making bureaucracy sound like the enemy, like official documents were just obstacles put in place by people who didn't understand real life. Dad was even more evasive. Whenever the topic came up, he'd suddenly remember something urgent he needed to do in the garage or outside. He'd grab his toolbox or find some project that absolutely couldn't wait. Looking back, I realized he was probably the worst liar in the family. His face would get red, and he'd start stuttering slightly, which only happened when he was nervous or hiding something. My aunts and uncles were part of the conspiracy too. Family gatherings had this weird dynamic where stories would flow freely about everyone else's childhood. But when it came to my early years, the conversation would hit this invisible wall. They'd talk about my cousins as babies, sharing embarrassing stories and cute anecdotes. But with me, they'd jump straight to when I was old enough to walk and talk. It was like the first few years of my life had been erased from the family narrative. School friends would sometimes comment on how different I looked from my parents. Kids are brutally honest about stuff like that, and more than one classmate pointed out that I didn't really resemble either mom or dad. I'd gotten used to brushing it off, telling myself that genetics were weird and that plenty of kids looked different from their parents. But deep down, those comments always bothered me more than I wanted to admit. The awkwardness extended to medical appointments too. Whenever doctors asked about family medical history, Mom would get vague and change the subject. She'd talk about general health in our family, but never got specific about genetic conditions or inherited traits. I always assumed she was just private about medical stuff, but looking back, her responses were suspiciously evasive. High school brought new questions. During biology class, when we learned about genetics and inheritance patterns, I started paying more attention to physical traits. Eye color, hair texture, bone structure. The more I learned about how characteristics passed from parents to children, the more I realized how little I actually resembled the people raising me. It wasn't dramatic enough that strangers would notice, but once you started really looking, the differences were pretty obvious. College was when the questions started eating at me more seriously. Being away from home gave me perspective on my family's weird habits. I'd visit friends' houses and see baby photos prominently displayed, hear stories about pregnancy and delivery, watch parents share embarrassing childhood memories. Normal families seemed to have this continuous narrative from birth onward, but mine had this strange gap at the beginning. I started dropping hints with Mom during phone calls, trying to get her to share more details about my early years. I'd ask about what I was like as a baby, whether I cried a lot, when I first walked or talked. Her answers were always generic, the kind of things you could say about any child. She never had specific memories or funny stories like other parents did. It was like she was describing a character from a book rather than recalling actual experiences. The internet made everything worse and better at the same time. I'd spend hours reading about adoption, family secrets, identity issues. Part of me wondered if I was adopted and they just never told me, but that didn't explain the strange name situation or why they'd be so secretive about it. Adoption wasn't shameful, and plenty of families were open about it. The secrecy suggested something more complicated. By my late teens, I developed this habit of studying my reflection, looking for any feature that might connect me to mom or dad. I'd catch myself doing it in bathroom mirrors, store windows, anywhere I could see my face clearly. Sometimes I'd convince myself I could see resemblances, but other times the differences seemed overwhelming. It became an obsession that I couldn't shake. Update 1. Everything changed when I turned 20. I was living in a small apartment near campus, working part-time and taking classes. It was one of those lazy Saturday afternoons when you end up falling down random internet rabbit holes. I've been watching documentaries on streaming services, jumping from topic to topic without any real plan. I clicked on this documentary about child trafficking and missing persons cases from the early 2000s. Honestly, I wasn't even paying that much attention at first. I was half watching while organizing my desk, sorting through old papers and textbooks. But something about one of the episodes made me stop what I was doing and actually focus on the screen. They were interviewing this woman who looked to be in her 40s, sitting in what appeared to be her living room. She was talking about losing her baby from a hospital in Texas around the time I was born. The way she described it made my stomach turn. She'd given birth normally, everything seemed fine, and then during one of those routine periods when nurses take newborns for testing or cleaning, her baby just disappeared. The woman was crying as she explained how the hospital staff initially told her there had been a mix-up with the paperwork, that they were looking into it. Hours turned into days, and eventually the authorities got involved. But by then, whoever had taken her child was long gone. She'd been searching for 20 years, never giving up hope that somehow, someday, she'd find her baby. What made me freeze completely was when they showed a photo of the missing infant. It was one of those hospital pictures they take right after birth, with the baby wrapped in a standard-issue blanket. The features were tiny and not fully developed like all newborn photos, but something about the face looked familiar in a way that made my chest tighten. I rewound the segment and watched it again. Then again. Each time, the resemblance seemed stronger. The shape of the eyes, the way the ears were positioned, even the little wrinkle pattern on the forehead. I grabbed a mirror and held it next to my laptop screen, comparing my adult features to this tiny infant from 20 years ago. My hands were shaking as I took screenshots of the documentary. I spent the next few hours researching the case online, finding every article and news report I could about this missing child from Texas. The timeline matched perfectly with my birth year. The location was only a few hundred miles from where I grew up. Most disturbing of all, the physical description of the missing baby aligned with characteristics I'd had as a young child. I called in sick to work the next day and spent 14 hours straight researching missing children cases, hospital security breaches, and infant trafficking rings. The more I read, the more convinced I became that I was looking at my own story. But I also knew how crazy it sounded. What were the odds that I'd randomly stumble across a documentary about my own kidnapping? Sleep became impossible. I'd lie in bed replaying every weird conversation with my parents, every evasive answer, every time they'd changed the subject when I asked about my early years. Suddenly, their behavior made perfect sense, but in the most horrifying way possible. They weren't just hiding adoption or some family embarrassment. They were hiding a crime. The hardest part was continuing to act normal around everyone while my entire world was falling apart. I had to go to classes, interact with friends, pretend everything was fine while internally screaming. I kept staring at my phone, wanting to call mom and demand answers, but knowing that a phone conversation wouldn't be enough for something this massive. I started having panic attacks in random places. The grocery store, the library, sitting in lecture halls. My chest would tighten and I'd feel like I couldn't breathe, overwhelmed by the possibility that everything I thought I knew about my life was a lie. I'd have to excuse myself and find somewhere private to hyperventilate until the feeling passed. After a week of barely functioning, I made a decision that terrified me. I found the contact information for the organization that had produced the documentary. My email was probably incoherent, full of typos and run-on sentences, but I tried to explain that I thought I might be connected to one of their cases. I attached the screenshots I'd taken and asked if there was any way to investigate further. I hit send before I could change my mind, then immediately regretted it. What if I was wrong? What if I was just some delusional college kid who'd watched too many true crime shows? What if this destroyed my relationship with my parents over nothing? But it was too late to take it back. Update 2. The response came faster than I expected. 3 days later, I had an email from someone at the organization explaining that they took these kinds of inquiries seriously and would be willing to facilitate contact with the biological mother if I was interested in pursuing genetic testing. They were professional but cautious, clearly experienced with people who thought they might be connected to missing persons cases. Reading that email felt like stepping off a cliff. Up until that moment, there was still a part of me that hoped I was wrong, that this was all some elaborate coincidence. But their willingness to move forward made it real in a way that terrified me. I spent 2 days staring at the email before responding that yes, I wanted to pursue testing. The process was surprisingly straightforward. They connected me with the woman from the documentary, and we arranged to do DNA testing through a service that could compare our samples. She was incredibly kind during our brief phone conversation, but I could hear the hope and desperation in her voice. She'd been through this before with other potential matches that hadn't worked out, but she was willing to try again. Waiting for the results was the longest month of my life. I threw myself into schoolwork and my job, trying to stay busy enough that I couldn't think about what the test might reveal. But late at night, when I was trying to fall asleep, the possibilities would overwhelm me. What if it was a match? What if it wasn't? Either outcome would change everything. I was in the middle of a particularly boring economics lecture when my phone buzzed with an email from the testing service. My heart started pounding so hard I was sure the people sitting next to me could hear it. I excused myself from class and found an empty hallway before opening the message. The results were conclusive. We were a genetic match. I was her son. I sat on the floor in that hallway and cried for probably 20 minutes. Students walked past, giving me concerned looks, but I couldn't pull myself together enough to care. Everything I'd suspected was true. I had biological parents who'd been searching for me for 2 decades, and the people who raised me had been lying about it my entire life. The woman, my biological mother, called me that same evening. Hearing her voice, knowing we were actually related, was surreal. She was crying and laughing at the same time, telling me how she'd never stopped looking, how she'd always believed she'd find me someday. She had so many questions about my life, my health, what I was studying, whether I was happy. That conversation lasted 4 hours. She told me about my biological father, who had also never given up hope. She described what I was like as a newborn during the brief time she had with me before I disappeared. She kept a baby book with footprints and hospital bracelet, items that proved I'd existed in her life, even if only for a few days. The most emotional part was when she explained how the loss had affected their family. They'd had other children later, but there was always this missing piece, this empty space where I should have been. She showed me photos over video chat of birthday cakes they'd made for me every year, family pictures with an empty chair, Christmas stockings hung for a child who wasn't there. Learning about my biological family was overwhelming in the best possible way. I had siblings I'd never met, grandparents who were still alive, an entire extended family who'd been wondering about me for 20 years. They'd kept my room exactly as they'd prepared it before my birth, hoping that someday I'd come home. But alongside the joy of finding them came the devastating realization of what the people who raised me had done. They'd stolen me from my biological family and built their entire relationship with me on a lie. Every birthday, every holiday, every moment of love and care had been tainted by this massive deception. Update 3. Confronting the people I'd called my parents was the hardest thing I'd ever done. I drove home from college on a Thursday afternoon, my stomach in knots the entire 3-hour trip. I'd rehearsed what I was going to say dozens of times, but none of it felt adequate for the magnitude of what I needed to discuss. They were both home when I arrived, which was unusual for a weekday. Mom was in the kitchen making dinner, and Dad was watching television in the living room. It was such a normal, domestic scene that I almost lost my nerve. These were the people who'd taught me to ride a bike, helped with homework, attended every school event. How do you accuse people like that of kidnapping? I asked them to sit down because I had something important to discuss. The change in their demeanor was immediate and obvious. Mom's face went pale, and Dad's hands started shaking slightly. They knew. Somehow, they'd been waiting for this conversation for 20 years. I pulled out my laptop and showed them the documentary episode, the DNA test results, everything I discovered. I watched their faces as the reality of the situation sank in. There was no surprise, no confusion, no denial. Just resignation and fear. Mom broke down first. She started crying and apologizing, saying she'd always known this day would come but had hoped it never would. She kept repeating that she loved me, that everything she'd done was because she loved me and couldn't bear to lose me. Dad just sat there staring at his hands, looking like he'd aged 10 years in 10 minutes. The story that came out was even more complicated than I'd imagined. Mom's friend, someone I'd known my entire life as a family acquaintance, had been the one who actually took me from the hospital. She'd been working there in some capacity and had access to the maternity ward. She brought me to Mom claiming that my biological mother had died during childbirth and that I needed a home. Mom insisted she believed that story initially. She said she'd wanted children desperately and had been trying for years without success. When her friend presented her with this baby who supposedly needed a family, it felt like a miracle. But as time went on and she heard about the missing child case in the news, she started to suspect the truth. The part that destroyed me was learning that she'd known for years that my biological parents were searching for me. She'd seen the news reports, the missing person flyers, the reward offers. She knew there was a family out there desperate to find their child, but she couldn't bring herself to give me up. She convinced herself that I was better off with them, that my biological parents would eventually move on and have other children. Dad's role was mostly passive, but that didn't make it better. He'd suspected something was wrong from the beginning but had chosen not to ask questions because he wanted to keep me too. He'd gone along with all the lies, all the evasions, all the cover-ups because the alternative was losing the son he'd grown to love. The friend who'd actually taken me had died in a car accident when I was 12. Mom said she'd taken the secret to her grave, leaving Mom and Dad as the only people who knew the truth. They'd lived with this guilt and fear for decades, always wondering when someone would figure it out. What made everything worse was realizing how genuinely they did love me. This wasn't a case of people who'd stolen a child for selfish reasons and then neglected or abused them. They'd been devoted parents who'd given me a good life, but they built that life on the foundation of someone else's tragedy. I stayed at their house for 3 days, and we talked almost constantly. They wanted to know about my biological family, whether I was planning to have a relationship with them, what this meant for our future. I couldn't give them answers because I didn't know myself. The guilt was eating them alive. Mom had developed anxiety and depression over the years that she now admitted was directly related to what they'd done. Dad had thrown himself into work to avoid thinking about it. They'd been living in constant fear that someday someone would knock on the door and take me away. Part of me felt sorry for them. They'd made a terrible decision 20 years ago and had been paying for it ever since. But another part of me was furious about all the lies, all the evasive answers, all the times they'd made me feel crazy for sensing that something was wrong with my origin story. Final update. The months that followed were the most emotionally complicated period of my life. I was trying to build a relationship with my biological family while figuring out what to do about the people who'd raised me. Both sides had legitimate claims on my love and loyalty, but the circumstances made everything impossibly messy. My biological parents were incredibly understanding about the situation. They were just grateful to have found me alive and healthy after 20 years of not knowing what had happened to me. They didn't push for immediate closeness or demand that I cut ties with my adoptive family. They just wanted to be part of my life in whatever way felt comfortable. Getting to know them was like discovering a missing part of myself. We had similar mannerisms, shared interests, and physical traits that finally made sense. My biological father and I both had this habit of drumming our fingers when we were thinking. My biological mother and I shared the same laugh and the same way of tilting our heads when we were listening carefully to someone. Meeting my biological siblings was overwhelming in the best way. I had a younger brother and sister who'd grown up hearing stories about their missing older brother. They'd been part of the search effort their entire lives, distributing flyers and attending awareness events. Finding me was like completing their family in a way they'd always hoped for but never quite believed would happen. The legal situation was complicated. Technically, what my adoptive parents had done was kidnapping, and there could have been serious criminal consequences. But my biological parents decided not to pursue charges. They said they'd gotten what they wanted most, which was finding me safe and knowing I'd been loved and cared for. Destroying the people who'd raised me wouldn't change the past or make the future better. My adoptive parents were devastated by the possibility of losing me entirely. They'd accepted that I needed to build relationships with my biological family, but they were terrified that I'd cut them out of my life completely. The fear of abandonment that had driven them to keep me in the first place was now threatening to become reality. Working through the forgiveness process was incredibly difficult. I loved the people who'd raised me, but I also couldn't ignore the magnitude of what they'd done. They'd stolen 20 years from my biological family and built our entire relationship on deception. Some days I felt like I could move past it, and other days the anger would overwhelm me. Therapy wasn't really an option given the complexity and legal implications of the situation. Instead, I found myself having long conversations with friends, reading everything I could about similar cases, and spending a lot of time alone trying to process everything that had happened. The breakthrough came during a family gathering with my biological relatives. I was watching my younger siblings interact with their grandparents, seeing the easy affection and shared history that I'd missed out on, when I realized something important. I couldn't get those 20 years back, but I could choose how to spend the next 20. I decided to maintain relationships with both families, but with very different boundaries. My biological family became my primary emotional support system, the people I turned to for major decisions and life events. My adoptive parents remained in my life, but more like distant relatives than immediate family. I still loved them, but trust would take time to rebuild, if it ever could be fully restored. The name situation finally made sense too. My adoptive parents had continued using the name they'd chosen for me rather than my legal birth name, which was another layer of identity theft I hadn't even realized. I decided to legally change my name back to what my biological parents had originally chosen, which felt like reclaiming a piece of myself that had been stolen. College became my refuge during this period. Being away from both families gave me space to figure out who I was without the weight of their expectations or emotions. I threw myself into my studies and started thinking seriously about career paths that would let me help other people in similar situations. The hardest part was accepting that there would never be a perfect resolution. My biological family had lost 20 irreplaceable years with me. My adoptive parents had to live with the knowledge that their love for me had caused immense pain to other people. I had to rebuild my entire sense of identity and figure out how to move forward with relationships that were fundamentally complicated. But there were also unexpected gifts that came from the situation. I had a larger family than I'd ever imagined, with twice as many people who cared about my well-being. I learned that identity is more flexible than I thought, and that love can survive even the most complicated circumstances. Most importantly, I'd finally gotten answers to the questions that had haunted me my entire life. The woman from the documentary became like a second mother to me. After 20 years of searching, she'd not only found her missing child but discovered that he'd grown up to be someone she was proud of. Our relationship developed naturally over time, built on genuine affection rather than just biological connection. My adoptive parents eventually went to counseling to deal with their guilt and fear. They started volunteer work with organizations that helped reunite missing children with their families, trying to make amends for what they'd done by helping other families in similar situations. It didn't undo the past, but it showed they understood the impact of their actions. Looking back now, I realized that my strange childhood had actually prepared me for this revelation in some ways. I'd always sensed that something was different about my story, so when the truth came out, it was more like confirmation than complete shock. The skills I developed for dealing with uncertainty and asking difficult questions served me well during the most challenging period of my life. I still don't know if I've completely forgiven my adoptive parents. Some days I feel like I have, and other days the anger resurfaces. But I've learned that forgiveness doesn't have to be all or nothing, and that relationships can continue to evolve even after major betrayals. What matters most is that I finally know who I am and where I came from, and I have the freedom to choose how to move forward with that knowledge. The story isn't really over. I'm still building relationships with my biological family, still working through complicated feelings about my adoptive parents, still discovering things about myself that make more sense now that I know my real history. But for the first time in my life, I feel like I'm living as my authentic self rather than as someone else's creation. And that's worth all the pain and confusion it took to get here.